are you have you done a lot of diving into the Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3? We was going over there yesterday.
Yes, I'm familiar with that.
And it's so much I don't even know where to be. I mean, okay. Do you have like a general breakdown understanding of the creation and like what went on in the garden?
I can give you my perspective, and my perspective is based on my approach to the text. Okay, and what I'll do, since I'm on the phone, and I like to just give people tools so they can study better, is I can give you what my methodology is for coming to my conclusions, right? So when we look at the text, a lot of times we have several things that occur when we start to read the text, and hopefully these insight can help somebody on the line. A lot of times we read the text with a presupposition, okay? That means that we are predisposed and influenced by particular dogma or doctrine before we even view the text. So if I'm told automatically that the Creator created all things, and I never read the book of Genesis, when I go back to read the book of Genesis, that will be in the back of my mind as I'm reading it, which means that that presupposition is going to influence my outlook and how I read the text, right? And a lot of times that is called deductive analysis, right? When we go from a conclusion and work our way to a fact or a point. For me, what works best is to flush from your mind any presuppositions and work inductively. That means that you look at the text itself for the facts, and once you're able to aggregate all the facts, you allow the facts to create your worldview as opposed to your worldview create what you want to see in the text. So I just want to put that out there for starters. And a good way to approach this is, number one, is whenever we're reading something in the text, and I always encourage people to do this, anytime you read a passage, the most important thing is to pick out the most interesting word and go look it up in the original language, right? Because a lot of times we lose a lot of the essence of what the author was conveying to the audience when we read things and interpret it from a Western worldview, right? And this creates our issues. And I give you a clear example. When you read Bereshit or Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? Now, there's two things in there that I always point out to help people better study, because a lot of times these things could be overlooked, right? And this is just the text giving you information. This is not you getting it from an external source and reading into the text, but this is the text giving you information. When you read that in Hebrew, we don't have the definite article the in the verse. So ha prefix to a particular word will indicate the definite article. When we read it in Hebrew, it's Bereshit. And when you have the beit prefix, that is a preposition meaning in or with. But there's no ha there, which would be the hey, which would indicate the definite article. So that means that in opening up, the author is telling the audience, I'm not telling you this is the definitive beginning of all, right? This is just a beginning. So the text is telling you what it's intending for the audience. The text is telling you that. So you don't have to read anything external to figure that out. The text is telling you, in a beginning, not in the beginning, in a beginning. Some form of a summit of things starting, this is what occurred. This is what's called relative chronology. That means you're looking at time based on how it relates to you immediate, as opposed to how it relates to the universe in all its vastness, right? So this is a good way to look at the text and be able to allow the text itself to explain to you what its intentions are, instead of you coming to the text with a presupposition to think that this is the beginning because the English says the beginning, but the text is not telling you this is the beginning. This is a Hellenistic worldview. When a lot of the Greek philosophers arose on the scene from the 6th, 5th century BCE onward, what they were attempting to do in philosophy, philos means brotherly love or love of, Sophie means wisdom, the love of wisdom. And what they were trying to do was they were trying to create abstract concepts and relate their understanding to constructs that are abstract and that is almost unperceivable. That is what the Western mind does. It tries to understand the unknown because I have to know it. Because if I don't know it, I don't know what's going to happen to me. This is why the Greek philosophers had so many dissertations back and forth, because it was so speculative and relative when it comes to philosophy that it got you almost nowhere. But it allowed you to create a whole bunch of corpuses of work based on what you think and how you feel, right? And this is what the Western world, this is how the Western mind thinks. The reason why the Western mind thinks that is because it relates to things based on its objectual appeal. What value does the object have on me, right? That's what the Western mind is concerned with. What value does the object have towards me? And we see this when we actually read our English, whatever the English work is. When we read the English work, a lot of the emphasis is always on the noun, right? Because nouns can be obscure, nouns can be mysterious, nouns can require philosophy to be applied to understand the noun. So a lot of times in English, a lot of our sentences begin with the noun first. In Hebrew, the sentences begin with the verb first, because the verb or the action or the event is what's immediately relative to the author conveying the information to the audience. So if the author in an Eastern Semitic worldview was only writing Bereshit to his immediate audience and conveying it to them relative to how creation relates directly to mankind, they're not concerned with how the angels got here. They're not concerned with what's on the outer skirts of our galaxy. They were not concerned with these things. But philosophers are concerned with these unknown variables that have no direct bearing on them directly, because this is how philosophy creates things, because of the way that man relates to the object. This is what's going on in the Western worldview. And when you read a lot of Hellenistic writings that came out of that time period, you'll see this is how they philosophized things, right? When Semites were more concrete, they were more concerned with the immediate things that affected their everyday lifestyle and things that occurred in the past that have a direct relation to their present and towards their future. It even gets so interesting that in the text itself, the only way you can differentiate present and future is context, because in Hebrew, you only have two participles, right? You have past participle and you have future participle. Or in Hebrew, more relatively in regards to grammar, it is the perfect and imperfect tense. The perfect tense is an action was completed at some time in the past. An event occurred sometime in the past and it's sealed, it's completed. That is the perfect tense. That is a non-modified verb. If the verb is modified, it becomes the imperfect tense, which means that it can either be an action that is ongoing, it started sometime in the past, and is currently ongoing, or an action that will take place. And the only way to determine between future and present participles in Hebrew is looking at context. And that's very important because, again, it teaches you how they view things. An example, the word olam, which means eternal, right? Their concept of eternal is something that was beyond the horizon. That means that if we're looking out towards the sea, the thing that we see in the immediate distance is the sun, and we see that the sun sets and the sun rises, right? So the horizon, as far as the eyes can see, because there's a limited point of view that we have in regards to our ocular structure and where we can view things, right? It's called a viewpoint or a vantage point. And once we see where the sea ends, we cannot see anything beyond that. So anything that's beyond that is still happening. There's things that are going on beyond that horizon that we can see, but being that we cannot see that distance, they were concerned with the future that they can see amongst their horizon or what their limitations were. That was their concern. Anything beyond that horizon, even though it may be going on, they left it up into the hands of the Creator to bring that knowledge to them, as opposed to them trying to seek it for themselves. They became reliant upon the Creator in that sense. So they only strove to influence their sphere that was their immediate environment. Anything beyond the horizon, they left it in the hands of the Creator. And this is how they wrote the text from this type of worldview. So we're looking at the text saying that in a beginning, the beginning that relates to us here on earth, not to angels, not to aliens somewhere else, but to us here on earth. The author is conveying the information that he was divinely inspired to write that was concerned with a particular beginning. And the second thing you want to look up is the word create, right? The word create is very abstract. It can refer to anything that was what is called in the Greek ex nihilo, something that was taken out of nothing. We get that concept of something out of nothing, and we believe that something came out of nothing and created everything from poof out of thin air, right? That is our Western worldview. But when we look at the word for create there, you have a trilateral root, and a trilateral root just means the root verb, and the root verb consists of 3 consonants. And in bara, it is beit resh aleph, right? And when we look at the various ways that bara is used in the text, it can even be used for the word berit. And berit means a covenant. Well, how do you get berit from bara, right? Because they're the same, they use the same root. How does one imply create, which I say falsely implies create, and the other one implies a covenant? Well, you have to look to see what is being referenced, right, in regards to barit. We have other places where bara is used to symbolize the fat of an animal, right, and how the fat of the animal can be used for food. It can be used for oils. It can be used for candles. The fat had various uses, right, the animal. So the fat was necessary along with the other parts of the animal that was used for other things to assist the people. But again, it had to do with an animal, the fat from an animal. And when you look at the word berit, it literally means passing through an animal, right? So you're cutting an animal in half and you're passing through an animal. And in ancient Semitic times, this is how an individual contracts a deity. Through a sacrifice that's made, the sacrifice is cut through to the fat, and the person passes through the fat. And this is indicative of contracting with a particular deity, which becomes a covenant. So the root goes back to the fat of a sacrifice or the fat of an animal. And there's various things you can do with that fat. So if we see it from that perspective, and we go back and look at this word bara, that in the English is telling us is the word create, and we look at it more concretely to mean the fat of something, right? Because the fat can also fill something. It would imply to us that something is being fattened, something is being filled, right? So in a particular start of something or genesis of something, something is being filled. And as you can see, bara precedes Elohim. So the verb precedes the noun. The authors are first concerned about the event or the action that's taking place before they're concerned of specifically who did it. So now this gives us more information that we don't have to go into a commentary somewhere, right, or be taught something, but we just allow the text to speak for itself, and it will bring more light to what it is that we're reading. I hope I'm making some sense here. Is anybody following me?
Yes. We following. Bring it out. Yes, this deep.
So then, and that's just reading the text and allow it to read for itself. And then you come up in the Hebrew if you read it, and I'll give you guys some help, right? If you guys want to learn Hebrew, the people on here who's probably not familiar with Hebrew but want to learn Hebrew, a good way to learn Hebrew is getting an interlinear Bible. Get an interlinear Bible, because what an interlinear Bible will do, it'll give you the Hebrew word, the Hebrew transliteration, it'll give you the English relative translation, which means that if I was reading Genesis 1:1 in an interlinear, it would say, "In the beginning created God the heavens and the earth." In English, that would be rearranged because it doesn't make any sense in English as far as grammar is concerned. But in Hebrew, that's literally how the text reads. And when a person who reads Hebrew or knows Hebrew, and let's say they don't know English, they're reading the text, that's exactly how it flows in their mind. So there's a lot of reconditioning that we have to do when it comes back to discerning the text. And an interlinear will definitely help you understand the text as it was meant for the audience as written by the author. And another thing in it that you'll see that's pretty perplexing is something that's called it, right? Which is Aleph Tav, right? It. And when you see this word it in there, it won't be translated. There's no direct English translation for it. So that would leave you to wonder, why would the author put that in the text? And at that time, obviously, because there was no English that was around during that time. And now looking at the text today, I don't have any equivalent to it. What does it mean? Well, a lot of times people would take an approach of pseudoism, and what they will do is that they'll attribute it to the Messiah or to some person that's coming to be in the future. They would relate that because you have Aleph Tav. Aleph is the first letter in Hebrew. Tav is the last letter in Hebrew, right? Aleph Tav, beginning and end. That's what people would say. Oh, it means beginning and end. And what they'll do is they'll exegete the text, which means that they'll read an interpretation into the text that the text did not intend for the reader to understand. Simply put, it is what's called a direct object marker, right? And a direct object marker, what it does is that it tells the reader that whatever noun precedes it, right, or whatever noun supersedes it. If a noun precedes it, then it's the subject. If a noun succeeds it, then it's the object. And in some cases, you may find a noun before and a noun after, depending upon the particular passage. But what that direct object marker is, it's pointing towards the accusative. The accusative is the object that the action is being done towards. That's Hebrew grammar. It's a direct object marker. And in English, we don't need it because when we read sentences such as John kicked the ball, right, we know that John is the subject and we know that the ball is the object because typically in English, we will always read a sentence that way. That's proper English. But in Hebrew, it can be read the other way. It could be read, the ball kicked John. But in Hebrew, it would say, the ball, it kicked John. And when we see it following the ball, it is telling us that that noun that is closest to it is the object. So it doesn't matter how you read it, but we have that object there in Hebrew that tells us what's the accusative or the object, and what's the subject that's doing the action towards that other noun. And this is why we don't have it in English, because English doesn't need it. But for certain passages in the text, if there's a direct action that's taking place, its emphasis by the author is telling the audience that this subject is directly impacting this object that I'm telling you about in this sentence. Nothing else is responsible but this particular subject. Does that make sense, family?
Yeah, I'm following.
The author is emphasizing that the subject, which is Elohim in this sense, is the direct entity responsible for the action that's taking place to the objects that's being mentioned. Nothing else is responsible but that entity. And that is what Genesis 1:1 or Bereshit 1:1 was trying to convey. The author was trying to convey to the audience that only this Elohim entity is responsible for the direct action of bara towards the Hashamayim or the heavens, where it's and direct object towards Haaretz or the earth. Hello?
Yeah. Did someone just have a question?
Somebody said something.
Maybe it was a mistake. So, okay, so word there. Now, when he was discussing when the Most High made male and female, and when he made Adam and Eve, is that the same account, or are those two different accounts?
All right. So I knew you was going to go there, right? So what I wanted to do I just wanted to give a brief example of how language is important. And nobody's gonna learn Hebrew overnight. It takes time, and the best way to learn it is using an interlinear and just looking up words. Get to be familiarized with root words. Root words will help you understand things, and I'm going to show you in regards to the question you asked me how language can help you decipher certain things, right? As well as context, culture, history, and subject matter, right? So my students, when I teach my students, I tell them, okay, if we're going to try to find something out from the text, we can do so without commentary, right? What you're going to do is look for what's called the syntactical lexical analysis of the text, which simply means looking up words. What does this word mean? What does that word mean? And how those words relate to each other within that particular sentence, right? That's the syntax. And the lexical part is the definition of the word. So anytime you read a word, I would say look for the most challenging word in the sentence and look it up. So for me, Genesis 1:1, the most challenging word would be the word bara, create. And it takes you somewhere much deeper. You're like, oh, okay. And then you go back and you read it again, and you say, oh, it implies something different than what the translation is. So it's always good to look up the words, right? Even if you don't know grammar, which will take some time. Grammar is basic principles, and then there's intermediate and advanced principles. So just look for words first, and the words are keys to help you to unlock your answer, right? So when we proceed on from Genesis 1:1, we go to Genesis 1:2. And what happens is you have people that believe in what's called the gap theory, right? So the gap theory is when people believe that there was a span of time between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2 that there's no details for. And this is very assumptive. And what people do is that they look for things in the rest of the text and pull from it and use it to plug into Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. And one theory that rises out of the gap theory is that between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, the angels were created. Between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, Satan or Lucifer had dominion over the earth. Between Genesis 1:1, Genesis 1:2, when Satan had dominion over earth that was created at that time, there were dinosaurs on the earth and other things on the earth. This is what the gap theory creates, but the text itself does not imply a gap theory. That is something that we read into the text because we see details later on in the text that can only make sense somewhere in the book of Genesis. But again, the author was not trying to tell you where angels came from. The author was not trying to tell you where Hashatan came from. The author was not trying to tell you these things. He was only concerned with the things that was immediately impacting life on earth. So if we look at it from that perspective, it starts to help us to understand what took place. Now, the question you asked had to do with Adam and Eve. Was Adam and Eve the first people on the planet, or were Adam and Eve distinct people that were on the planet from other people that was on the planet? And you see a lot of people will propose this because people would say, well, Cain left and he went east to Nod and grabbed a wife. And how do you find a wife if there was nobody else on the planet but Adam and Eve, right? So you'll hear these type of complaints, and people will try to rationalize these type of complaints by reading into the text, right? And a lot of times, if we allow the text to speak for itself, it will give us information. There's other things that we can do to better ascertain what the text is saying, but I just want to be very simplistic so that way I can immediately equip people to just go back and read it again and get the information. Go into Genesis chapter 1, and we jump down. Now, mind you, remember I said that bara has to do with the fat of an animal, right? And we look to see how the Creator was creating everything, right? He created the light first. It says, oh, he created the light. Some people say, well, how did he create the light on day 1 if the sun didn't come about to day 4, right? You hear people that also make that argument, right? And there's a scientific explanation for that as far as the clouds that were there that were translucent. And you'll see as he's separating and pulling, he is making way for things that previously was not there. When we go to Genesis chapter 1, going to verse 14, where it says, Elohim said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heaven, separate day from night, blah, blah, blah. The word that's used there is asaf. Asaf is used there, and asaf does not mean creating something brand new. It just means to establish something. Something already existed, and what you're doing now is you're giving it its decree. You are establishing it. And that is what he was doing. He was establishing the moon, sun, and stars. Why? Because he said these 2 great lights, one is going to govern the day, one is going to govern the night. And he says not only are you going to give light to the earth, day and night, but they're also going to be there for times, for seasons. The word season is moed. Moed is the same word that we find for festivals or meaning times or congregational times, right? The sun, moon, and stars are utilized for that. So he's not creating the sun, moon, and stars from scratch and on the 4th day. What he's doing is that substance was already there and he was establishing it. Right? Hence why plants could be there on the earth before the sun, because if you have translucent light, the chlorophyll in the plants can still be activated, right? But if you don't have sun, then you don't have UV light to sustain plant life. But if there is a cloud cover and it's translucent, now the UV light can get through, and the UV light can activate the chlorophyll in the plants, and now the plants can keep their commandment to bring forth, right? So, again, he's separating things and he's filling things. He created the heavens, and then he put the sun, moon, and stars in the heavens. Then he put the birds in the heavens. Then he created the dry land. He put the beasts of the field on the land. He put man on the land. He created the deep ocean, put the animals in the ocean, everything. So he has substance that he's working with. He's shape, forming, and fashioning, and then he's filling these things. He's populating it. And then he places man there. And this is what we get to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. In chapter 21, verse 26, this is very interesting because, again, we keep seeing this word Elohim there, right? And in Hebrew has grammar rules, right? So if I have a plural noun, the verb also has to be plural. Because if the verb is not plural and the noun is plural, there is a grammatical error there. But we see it in the text. But what people do is that because it seems like there's an error, they try to fix it. So I'll explain what I mean by that. When the text says God created the heavens and the earth, it actually says bara Elohim. Bara is he created, Elohim, which is plural, the heavens and the earth. So the implication is that there is a council. There is multiple deities. There's multiple things that are creating everything. That's what the text literally reads. But when people see this from a monotheistic perspective, it doesn't make sense. So what they had to do is they had to create a new grammatical rule to make sense of what they're reading. And that grammatical rule is called a majestic plural. And anybody out there, you can write it down, look it up, majestic plural. And majestic plural helps to answer why we see a plural noun with a singular verb. That is erroneous in Hebrew grammar, but it's there in the literature, so people try to make sense of it because they don't want the text saying, and the powers that be created the heavens and earth. People get fearful of that. But you know where they don't get fearful at? When it comes down to verse 26, when it says, let us make man. How could the let us make man be okay, but you have an issue when you see Elohim, which is plural? But the let us implies or denotes plurality. See, there's something going on there in the text that is being shadowed from us, right? That's being covered from us. Because once it's unraveled and we let the text speak for itself, we see something from a completely different vantage point. And that's just my perspective on that from research. Going to Genesis 1 and 26, we see that these creatures that's being made, this let us make man in our image, this word for man is what we have to look up. When it says, let us make man, that word there is Adam, where we get the proper noun Adam. It's Adam. Let us make Adam in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion. In Hebrew, anytime you hear u at the end of a verb, it denotes plurality, right? Let them have. So this is why when we read the text and we see Adam there in the singular sense, and then we go to we yedu, which means let them have dominion, or they have dominion, and they have dominion, or they will possess the dominion. And that's this verb tense there. We know that the word Adam is referring to something plural, and it's implying plurality and not a singular noun. The noun's not singular. So again, the text itself is giving us that information. So that means we're looking at the word Adam, and it's not meaning Adam or a man or a singular person. So at least reading here in Genesis 1 and 26, we know that whatever Adam is, it's plural. It's not one thing. It's plural. And then it says...
Can I add something to that? Because like in Genesis chapter 5, verse 2, it says, male and female created he them and blessed them and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. So, yeah, I noticed that it says there. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. And that's additional information that we get as we're proceeding through the text, right? But even before we get to Genesis 5 and 2, we have to see what Genesis 1 is telling us first before we even get to the next chapter. And what it's telling us is that Adam is exemplifying a plurality of something. Whatever this creature is that the Most High has created, which is distinct from everything else that precedes verse 26, it is something that he has created that now has dominion over everything else. And that's very important, that this thing has dominion. So we have to keep that in mind, because if Adam, in this sense, is referring to people that existed before we get to Genesis chapter 2, and to keep this is very important, then that begs to differ. Does this also take an account for this Adam proper noun that we see in Genesis 2 that is placed in the garden, or is this separate and distinct from that entity? Because then we would have to take the dominion away from that creature in Genesis chapter 2. Because in Genesis chapter 2, we have to read to see if the Adam in chapter 2, was he given dominion? Was he given dominion? Because if he was not given dominion, then that means that whatever this Adam creature that we read in Genesis chapter 1 is not the same thing that we're reading in Genesis chapter 2. Or if it is, or if it does include him, how do we harmonize it, right? So I'll get to Genesis chapter 1. So after we've seen this Adam is plural in Genesis 1, going to Genesis chapter 2, we see that something interesting takes place, right? So when we go to Genesis chapter 2 and 4, it says, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that Yah Elohim made earth and heaven. Now that right there, Genesis 2 and 4, is part of the summary in Genesis 1, and Genesis 2 and 1, 2 and 2, 2 and 3, and 2 and 4. This is all a summary that's summarizing something that took place. It says, thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their hosts, which means that some event preceded the summary that we're looking at in Genesis 2 and 1. Something occurred, and then now they are finishing off the clause by saying, thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their hosts. And it says, by the seventh day, the Most High completed his work, which he had done, and he rested on the Sabbath day from all his work, which he had done. Then Elohim blessed the seventh day and set it apart, because in it he rested from all his work, which he had created and made. Very interesting. So now we see that a summary is taking place that is summarizing what took place in Genesis chapter 1. Okay? So when we go to Genesis chapter 5, it starts to say, there was now no shrub of the field was yet in the earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprouted, for the Most High had not sent rain upon the earth, and there was no man to cultivate the ground. Now we're proposed with something very difficult. If we believe that people were already on the planet in Genesis chapter 1, when we go to Genesis chapter 2, verse 5, it says, no man was there to cultivate the ground. How could that be if people were created in Genesis chapter 1? How come there was nobody there to cultivate the earth? And then when we look up the word for man there, it's the word again, Adam. Adam is there. There was no Adam on the earth to cultivate the ground. But how is that the case when Genesis chapter 1 just told us that he created man in his own image? And he gave that Adam that we saw in chapter 1 dominion over everything. Unless this is referring to something more specific, right? And when you continue to read, it says, but a mist used to rise from the earth and water the whole surface of the ground. Then the Most High formed man of the dust from the ground. He formed man. What's the word there for man again? Again, we got to look for another clue. He says, and he formed man, which is the word Adam again. But the problem is, it says ha-Adam. Ha is a definite article, and it should read, and the Most High formed the man from the dust of the ground. And the word for ground there is Adamah. So you're taking the root word Adam, and you're adding a feminine suffix. And a lot of times in Hebrew, when you add a feminine suffix, it denotes a abstract concept, right? Which means that it's something that is more transcendental or more all-encompassing. So instead of now Adam being a singular man that we saw that was a creation or something that the Most High created distinctly, the Adamah, which he came from, because he came from it, represents some kind of substance that is the same as the actual being that was created from that substance. So now we're seeing something interesting taking place here that we didn't see in Genesis chapter 1. We don't know how those Adam came to be. The scripture doesn't say, poof, he said, let there be, and they just came out of anywhere. They were made somehow, but the text is not explicit. When we get to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7, it's explicit. And it says that the man, right, or the Adam, from ha-Adamah, from the ground, the man from the ground. So now what this can apply to us is that now this is a distinct situation that this individual or this creature that's being created is now have a distinct creation that we didn't see in Genesis chapter 1. Now, whoever this Adam is being pulled from Adamah, as opposed to Genesis chapter 1, where we don't see this happening for whatever that creature is there. We don't know. So this is very interesting because now this sets the stage for a more personal creation. In Genesis chapter 1, it was more of a general creation. In Genesis chapter 2, it's more of a personal creation. This is very important that we understand it, because even looking at Genesis chapter 1, there's one thing that we don't see there that we see in Genesis chapter 2, and that is the tetragrammaton, Yod He Wav He. We don't see that in Genesis chapter 1, but we see it in Genesis chapter 2. Well, why is that? Why don't we see it in Genesis 1, but we see it in Genesis chapter 2? Because anytime you see the name of the Creator, that means that whatever account is being given is personal. Because when we read the story of Abraham and you see the Most High's name in the book of Genesis, where it talks about Yehovah, Yahweh, however you want to say it, Elohim appeared to Abraham, but then we jump to Exodus chapter 3, where the Most High says to Moshe that El Shaddai is how your forefathers knew me. They didn't know me by Yod He Wav He. That would make the text seemingly inconsistent, unless whoever the author was redacted it, so that way now when we're talking about Genesis chapter 2 and we insert the name of the Creator in Genesis chapter 2, and then later on in Genesis chapter 12 and 13, 14, so forth with Abraham, we're talking about a personal account. Now he's getting personal with this creation in Genesis 2, whereby which in Genesis chapter 1, it was more general, right? Because again, when we read Genesis 1 and 27, it doesn't tell us how this creature was created. It doesn't tell us that. It's not explicit at all. It just says bara. That's it. He filled the earth with this new creature. It doesn't say how it came to be. But in Genesis chapter 2, we have another instance where something personal is taking place, and this creature is being brought up from the ground. So, could this be referring where it says no shrub of the field was yet in the earth? Is that referring to the whole earth that the first Adam was placed? Or is this referring to a particular portion of the earth in regards to this new creature that's being brought from the ground? So from what I just spoke just now, you can take from it that whatever was done in chapter 1, there was probably a whole bunch of Adam, plural, in Genesis chapter 1, floating around, right? And then when we get to Genesis 2, a specific thing took place that is not mentioned in chapter 1. And not only a specific thing, when we read the rest of it, we see that its counterpart was given to this Adam creature. A counterpart was given to it. And we don't see the sense of a counterpart being assigned to the creature in chapter 1. We just see it as being plural, consisting of two opposing things, a male and female. We don't see that something was created or that a portion of one was taken and created that. We don't see that in Genesis 1, right? So I'm just trying to give you guys what the text is implying before we read into it, whatever our presuppositions are, and we see it from our worldview. But when we read the text, we can allow the text to speak to us by itself, and it will give you everything that you need to figure out what's going on. So again, what people try to do is they try to figure out, how did Cain get his wife? Who's this woman that Cain married? Is this, and it's only two theories. The two theories is either there were other people on the earth that's not mentioned, and he went to another part of the earth and found her there and married her, or she was his sister. Now, there are other extra-biblical texts that was written by Yahudim or by those who people call the Jews, and these other additional texts, one of them being the Book of Jubilees, gives you information, additional information that the text doesn't say for itself. When we read the Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus, he also gives additional information that we don't see here in the text. So you'll see that these people who wrote these pieces of literature had a tradition that ran alongside of the written text. And what they're doing is they're supplementing this tradition to get you to better understand the detail that the text itself does not explicitly convey to us. The text does not tell us that the person that Cain got was either his sister or some woman that was created from Genesis chapter 1. The text is not explicit, so it leaves room for interpretation and speculation, which is okay, because the author was not concerned in telling you who his wife was, where she came from. The author was not concerned about that. That was not important. You know why? Because whoever that individual was, she was wiped away. All of Cain's seed was destroyed. So whoever was writing this text did not have a lot of emphasis on where the origin of this woman was, because eventually she would end up in perdition or destruction alongside Cain and all of his seed. So again, the author is writing things that are relative to the events that they're trying to convey to the audience, and they're not trying to look at all the unknown variables. That's what the Hellenistic Western mind does, that the Semitic mindset that wrote this corpus was not concerned with, right? And it's fun to do that, because that's how we learn to read the text. But when you start to recondition your mind, you'll start to put yourself in the shoes of the author, and you'll see how certain things that we've interjected into the text really doesn't matter, right? We get the information we need based on what is written and what the author intended for that audience. And once we're able to ascertain that, then we can extract the principle if it no longer directly applies today, and find some way to take that information and make it practical today. I don't want to just keep going on and on. I would love for somebody else to interject and to add their perspective from their research, what they gain, because I would love to learn too.
Okay, well, I don't know. Where I was thinking also, it is out text outside of chapter 1 and 2, but when Cain was cast out, he told the Most High, if I go out there, they will kill me. And when he left, he went to a land that was named already with people there. So that's why I, included that. Obviously, they weren't the only people there. Or, I look at the Genesis as the beginning of our history, going back into the Hebrew history. Not saying like, and maybe also account of the beginning, but also like maybe chapter 1 was an account of the creation, and then chapter 2 is talking about, chapter 2 is more so talking about our history and how we came to be and giving more detail to it. Meaning that there probably were other people there, but they weren't significant according to this book right now, what we was reading. So I don't know how you feel about that. When you're saying like stick to the text, so what are you saying? What do you see according to the text? Are you saying that the story is referring to Adam separate from the chapter 1 creation, or do you see it as the same? Anybody? Hello?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm just, can you hear me?
I'm here. Oh, okay.
Hello?
I thought y'all was asleep or something.
No. I was muted.
Oh, yeah, it was a lot of noise coming through. But yeah, so that's what, that's what gave me that. And anybody have something they want to add?
Yeah, I figured, I thought there was people already here too, and because, when it's talking about that river that went out of Eden and watered, like, it went into 4 heads, and it's talking about, images Ethiopia, Gion, Havilah, and like another one, another river that went out into these places. So, yeah, Euphrates and Assyria. So,
So I guess we kind of was going over this already yesterday. So yeah,
right.
I don't know. Yeah, I see what he's saying though with Lord. They got to capitalize up in chapter 2, and that would make more sense too. As where I saw it is like in the beginning, like chapter 1 was man being created by Elohim, but in chapter 2, this is the breath of life being breathed, into Adam, and that breath of life to me is like, that's being set apart. That's like the law, he became a living soul.
Mm-hmm.
He probably was a soul, but he became a living soul then, that's the way I saw it.
Mm-hmm.
But what that breath of life stood for. Anybody else got something? Okay. But yeah, that's what I think. That because I'm checking a few things out that he said right now. I'm a little, that makes sense. But yeah, because I didn't notice that in chapter 2 that it is a difference. Like in chapter 1 it says God, or in the Hebrew would say Elohim, which is plural, and El is singular, but it says Elohim. But then when you get to chapter 2, it's Lord, capitalized, which will be Yahweh himself, breathed. He formed he formed Adam from the dust of the ground, and he breathed the breath of life in his nostrils. Now, in chapter 1, it say that man was created, but in chapter 2, it say he was formed, and that he became a living soul.
And again, that's a great way to go back over the text and look at it and just look for things you didn't see before, because that's the best way for us to study, is not always to assume that what we're reading is correct, but just to go back and look it over. So it's even seeing, L-O-R-D, which we know is Yahweh, Yahuwah, Yahweh. When we see that in Genesis chapter 2 and we don't see it in Genesis chapter 1, there's a distinction that is occurring. Why did the author decide to place that in Genesis 2 but left it completely out of Genesis chapter 1? And I barely hear anybody really mention that when it comes to dealing with the book of Genesis, but that's something that's very important. There's a reason why a personal name is placed there as opposed to a general name that's there in Genesis chapter 1. Because something distinct is going on. And I'll throw this back at you guys too, since you guys are there. When the Most High created Adam, proper noun Adam, in Genesis chapter 2, what day was he made?
That's what I brought up yesterday.
What day was he made?
Which one? The one that counted in chapter 1 or chapter 2?
Chapter 2. Adam, the proper noun Adam, the one that was placed in the garden. What day was he made?
Was it?
I don't know. I know it was, I forgot because I wrote it down. I got to find my notes, but I did notice like it was on both accounts had like different days, if I'm not mistaken. I'm trying to think.
Because the question would be, if Genesis chapter 2 says in verse 1, thus the heavens and the earth were completed and all their host. So a host is an inhabitant of the heavens and the earth. And it says, by the seventh day, Elohim completed his work which he had done. He rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then Elohim blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which Elohim had created and made. This is the account of the heavens and earth when they were created in the day that Yah Elohim made the heaven and the earth. So now, if all the work is done and all the hosts are therein, is he working now on the seventh day by making another creature? Or act take place on the sixth day, right? What's going on here? Or is this the eighth day? Is this the eighth day?
He was created on the first day. It started over. We got 7 days. He rested on that day, and it starts over to the first day. So obviously he was made. I don't know. I'll go back on mute.
So if you say it's on the eighth day, that's interesting, because remember, when the Most High was speaking to Moshe in Shemot chapter 20, and he gave him the 10 Commandments, right? And he was saying to him about what the significance of the seventh day was. He said that all the works which the Most High created was done in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. He didn't say, okay, I rest on the seventh day, but you know what? I worked again on an extra day on the eighth, and I made something else. I just hid it from you, and everybody else knows. I'm going to tell you that you know. The eighth day is not an additional day that he was creating things, because everything was completed. Remember, in Hebrew, you have the perfect tense, which means that the event had already taken place. And we see that in Genesis chapter 2, that the verb there for finished is in the perfect tense, and which means that it was something that was an event that had already completed. So that means nothing else was created after that point. So if Adam in chapter 2 was made, then we can imply that he was made on that sixth day if those 6 days consisted of everything that the Creator created. Otherwise, he wasn't being truthful to Moses. He told Moses he did everything in 6 days. If he still was working, then he had to tell Moses, listen, there's actually 8 days of work. The 7th day you can rest, but the 8th day you got to work again, and then you start another 8 days. You know, he didn't really say that to Moshe. So that's a good question to ask because the text seems to be misleading, right? Because we see at the beginning of Genesis saying that all the works were created and he rested on the 7th day, but then we see in verse 4 going on, something else is happening. It's like, where did this come from? I thought he created everything already. I thought everything was already done. You know?
So is chapter 2 actually explained in chapter 1?
Now you get another perspective in regards to what transpired in chapter 1. Or we can say, look, chapter 2 is just giving us more details from things that were shrouded in chapter 1, because chapter 1 was just an overall account of what was being done, and chapter 2 is the personal account on what was created, right? So this is important, you know, because remember it says, now the shrub of the field was yet in the earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprouted. Well, when we read in Genesis chapter 1, and we go to the 3rd day, it says specifically that he said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. So if these plants are here already yielding, when we get to Genesis chapter 2, it says, no shrub of the field was yet in the earth, and no plant of the field had sprouted. See, that's interesting. Now, some people say that when we read Genesis chapter 2, verse 5, when it's talking about no plant of the field had yet sprouted, it's in reference to bearing fruit, right? Now, fruit is there on plants to feed animals and humans. Animals eat fruits, humans eat fruits, right? So if the earth was, if everything was growing, we can see that he put the commandment out, and everything was coming into place. Everything was producing, giving, but in its own season. Just like now, all the plants don't grow in its own. For example, if I plant an apple tree and then I go plant a cabbage patch, right? The cabbage patch is going to grow and yield food faster than the tree is going to grow and yield food, right? Apple trees take a couple of years before it yields fruit. But that cabbage is good the next season once I plant it, and I can eat it. So everything in its own kind, the text is saying, is yielding. So wherever this garden was at, was something particular was happening. Whatever was growing there took time to yield. Why? Because the Creator was forming something interesting that was responsible for feeding off of whatever that those plants were yielding in that region. Right? That's another perspective that some theologians give in regards to viewing the text. Right? So again, you know, you'll have people who come against Torah and they'll say that, in the book of Genesis, there's contradictions. You know, how could you have plants growing and yielding in Genesis 1, but Genesis 2, it says nothing sprouted yet? That's contradiction. And it goes to show whoever's saying that has an agenda to try and disprove the text, as opposed to trying to harmonize and understand what the text is trying to yield to the audience. And that's being objective and that's being fair, you know.
So how do you harmonize this, man?
Well, that's not my job. All I'm doing is pulling out the possibilities, you know, and giving the tools to go back and just look at it again and try and come to a consensus based on letting the text speak for itself, right? And it's very difficult for us to flush what we knew and read the text anew again, because a lot of times we may feel that if we flush, we are disconnecting ourselves from the experience that brought us into what we know today. But that's not what it is. All that does is that us coming into the truth created the platform or the springboard for us to go further in our studies, further in our understanding. So once you have that experience to know that the Most High is real and the Most High is the patron deity over the children of Israel, and that it is his primemost duty to watch over us, to protect us, to guide us, to lead us, to raise us up. Once we come into that knowledge, then he brings us back to his text and say, listen, I left this record to give you what I need you to know, right? Anything outside of it, in regards to him, you don't really need to know. And if you do, the Ruach HaKodesh would lead and reveal those things to you. But in interim, now you're coming back to the text. Read it afresh without the influences of your mama, your daddy, your friend, your congregation, camp, and read it again and allow the text to speak to you, right? Because a lot of times we have the echo in our back of our mind of something a video we saw, something with comments we read, and we never let the text speak to us for itself. Because when you do, you'll see things you never seen there before, like what is LORD doing in 2 and it's not there in 1? Oh, you know what? Nobody never really spoke about this. Nobody brought this up to me before. I just realized that was there. You know, and then you start to say, oh wow, I didn't see that before. And then the text starts speaking to you afresh. And then you're like, oh, okay, let me investigate this. Let me see what's going on here, you know?
So that, I don't know, to me that seems like, okay, maybe, okay, it says, so Elohim is in chapter 1, and that's who created. But it says the Lord formed Adam. So is this like a different account? You know, is this the Most High himself that formed Adam?
See that? That's called critical thinking. The sister is good. All I'm doing, again, I don't like to tell people what I subscribe to. All I do is share things so people can come to their own conclusions, because I don't want to mislead people off a path that the Most High has them on. So all I do is give them the tools, teach them how to critically think, how to better analyze, and then from there they get to form their own path. And to me, that I try to become the teacher that I would want to teach me, you know. And I don't want nobody to force me to walk in their shoes. I want somebody to teach me how to make my own shoes and walk in them myself, right? So again, this is bringing critical thinking. And I'll give you something interesting. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8, right? Because you're going to see something in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8 that may relate, because the sister's saying something, and I think she's right now, she probably didn't realize it before, but she's trying to make sense of what she's reading now, and she can't quite put her finger on it. She's trying to put her finger on it. But if you go to Deuteronomy 32 and 8, anybody could read that. And if you read it, it's very interesting. Verse 8 and verse 9. Somebody read that.
I read. It says, when the Most High divided the nations, their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel.
When he separated the sons of who?
Adam.
Sons of Adam. Okay, keep going.
He set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel.
Okay. And no, keep going.
For the Lord's portion is his people.
Oh, wait. For who?
The Lord's portion is his people.
Lord's portion.
Mm-hmm. For the Lord's portion is his people. Mm-hmm. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance.
Okay. So now we see a situation where in Genesis chapter 8, it's given us a generic title. Some generic title entity did something. And then now when we go to verse 9, it's more specific to Yod-Vav-He singling out his people and getting his allotment of his inheritance. What? Jacob is the allotment of the Most High's inheritance? That's interesting. Got to read that, family. Read what that's very interesting. For Yah's portion is his people, and Yaakov or Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. Wait a second. Are you saying that some entity divided everything out, and then once everything was divided out, now Yah is going to choose his inheritance, and he's calling it Yaakov or Jacob or Israel? That's interesting, family. That's very interesting. But again, we see where Yod-He-Vav-He is, it's talking about something personal. But prior to it is general. Okay.
See, Genesis chapter 1 through 3 is so much. There's so many little nuggets up in there.
Right.
And
You know?
what you got for chapter 3 in Genesis? Give us some little something so we can go back and read that too.
You're going to pull everything out of me tonight, I see. All right, so, and I hope this is okay. I want to make sure I have permission from everybody on the line just to continue, just to share some information so we can build together. I don't want to take over the line. I don't want to say more than I need to. So if it's okay with everybody, I'll be more than happy to proceed if it's okay with everybody. I want to respect everybody who's on the line tonight.
Do your thing, brother.
Yes.
All right, thank you for your permission. Got to ask permission from the elders before I proceed. All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So now you see Genesis chapter 3. Now I want to get a quick consensus from everybody. If you guys are comfortable with volunteering this information. If not, you don't have to say anything. On the line tonight. How many people identify as being messianic, and how many identify as being what they call non-messianic?
I'm messianic.
I think we all messianic. It's like 10 people on the phone.
All right, so everybody on the line is messianic for the most part, Khan?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I didn't hear no objections to that. All right. So if that's the case, and I say that respectfully because I want to make sure that my approach can cater to both audiences, right? And I don't want to exclude anybody. Okay. So she asked me about Genesis chapter 3. Now, is there something specific in Genesis chapter 3, or do you want me just to point out nuggets in there for you?
You can point out the nuggets like we was going over this. We definitely going to go through all this again. But, anything you can give us, because we was going over this yesterday. And, this really happened, with our study. So any little nuggets you got for chapter 3, that'll help.
Sure. Okay, so this is, Genesis chapter 3 is very interesting because, we see for the first time dialogue between various creatures in the text with the exclusion of the Creator, right? So we see an entity called the serpent speaking and talking to the woman and having a dialogue with her in the absence of her husband and in the absence of the Creator, right? So a lot of times women are more sensitive, right, to things in the environment, whether they can put their finger on it or not. And if they can't, it's intuition. And they're more sensitive to these things. Hence why you'll see in a lot of occult worldviews where the woman would be the clairvoyant that is utilized to communicate more accurately with the ethereal realm. And I say this because there's a specific reason why the woman was approached as opposed to the man. And before I get into that, I want to show you guys something that's interesting, right? So you can go back and study. I'm going to get back to Genesis 3. If you go to Genesis chapter 5, verse 2, that the sister brought out earlier about he created them male and female, I want you guys to go back and look up to see what that word male means. It's really interesting. If somebody got a concordance, you look up in a concordance. If you got a lexicon, you look up a lexicon. See what that word male means. I want to give you that nugget. And I say that because it relates back to everything we were talking about so far in the book of Genesis. There's a reason why that word for male means something. It does not mean, it implies gender because we associate the word gender with that, but it actually is a word that means something else.
What it mean?
So, what? No, I can't tell you that. You need to go back and research.
All right.
Put that down for your homework. And again, these are little nuggets, again, that a lot of times, if you don't do a lot of in-depth study, you may overlook. A lot of times, sometimes you may not see it unless somebody points it out. But when you go back and you read it and you see, oh, wow, this is interesting, then it starts to make sense what the role of the male is. The male has a very important role that a lot of times that we don't know because we don't actually investigate to see how a distinction is made between male and female. It's very interesting once you read it. So going back to Genesis chapter 3, I will say this, and this is important that I lay this out, and I say this because I have a messianic stance, right? But my messianic stance is very distinct from a lot of the people out there. Now, Navi'yah, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I shared some of my information with her, so she heard some of my audio sessions, right? You heard some of my audio sessions, right?
Yeah, I heard your lecture. Yeah.
Yeah. So my audio sessions, I start to lay out my premise in regards to my messianic stance. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because when we read Genesis chapter 3, we automatically have a presupposition, or we already have an idea that was supplanted in our mind that guides how we read the text. Unfortunately, that leads us to creating a doctrine that the text did not imply specifically, right? It may imply it generally, but specifically it doesn't apply, and I'll explain what I mean by that. When we go to Genesis chapter 3 and we go to verse 15, right, a lot of people attribute this to being a messianic prophecy, right? And a lot of people who refer to being a messianic prophecy say that it is in relation to a virgin birth, right? And again, I'm not on the line tonight to tell people what I personally subscribe to. That's irrelevant. What I am doing is getting people to critically analyze the text, right? So that way they can better decide for themselves what they are reading and comprehend it better. When we read Genesis chapter...
I'm sorry, but I did always want to know why did they, if you know, maybe you can explain me, why do they say that is Christ? Like when that verse, I don't know why, do you know why they say that that's Christ?
Yes, the reason why they say that that's Christ is because they were church fathers who were responsible for codifying the common doctrine in Christianity. And these church fathers, the majority of them, almost all of them, were converts into the cultural paradigm that was initiated by the Messiah and his disciples. So there was a particular paradigm that they formulated that was based on their culture, and it became an embodiment of the lifestyle. And outsiders that were coming in, because they did not understand it, right, they deemed it to be a religion. And what they did was they brought their presuppositions from their prior way of life, which was mostly influenced by Greco-Roman mythology, and they took that presuppositional knowledge and they imposed it upon this new information, or this new way of life that they were observing. And what was common in Greco-Roman literature and mythology is that you had these demigods, right? And a lot of these demigods were half man, half God, Perseus, Hercules, etc., right? And the thing that made them distinct to be heroes is that they were both divine and they were both man. And this concept is a Greco-Roman concept. A demigod is a Greco-Roman concept, right? And it's clear from anybody who reads the background, church fathers, and you see how they perceive certain, right? How certain traditions started to spring up, how they latched onto certain traditions, and they made it authentic because it was in alignment with their presuppositions that they had before coming into this cultural paradigm that was initiated by Yahusha and his apostles, or his disciples, his followers, okay? And the reason why I say this is because prior to that, nobody read Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 as being a messianic prophecy specifically. And I'm going to explain why when I'm done. I'm going to explain why, right? Nobody read it to imply that specifically. Now, it was in relation to a future event that would take place, but it was never deemed to be a messianic text. It was only coined that way by the early church fathers, and then it was then built upon by the successive waves or generations of Christianity that came on the scene after them, after they laid down the blueprint, right? So, from my perspective on how I interpret the text, remember I tell you guys, I try to let the text speak for itself, and I try not to read into the text my prior presuppositions, right? And when you do that, the text starts to make more sense. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. We all know the story that happens in Bereshit chapter 3, where the serpent is speaking to the woman, and he beguiles the woman to eat of the fruit, and then she gives the fruit to her husband, and both of them are condemned, right? When the Creator is approaching them, he calls for the man and says, "Where are you?" The man. So he goes to Adam first. He didn't go to the serpent first. He didn't go to Eve first. He went to the man first. And when he went to the man, he called him and said, "Where are you?" The man said, "I heard your sound. I was afraid, hid myself." The Creator said, "Who told you you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree which I commanded you not?" The man said, "The woman." So now, instead of the man owning up to his fault, he casted the blame or projected the blame onto the woman, right? And this is what's called casting liability or adding insurance. So when you add insurance, the objective is to allow somebody else to take the liability for your actions. This is why insurance is a multi-trillion-dollar industry, because nobody wants to take responsibility for their actions, and if they do, they want to take partial responsibility and they want somebody else to cover them, right? This is in our nature, and we can see that in the book of Genesis chapter 3. Very interesting. But when he goes to the man, he asks the man what's going on. He then points to the woman, and the woman points to the serpent. Now, the serpent has nobody to point to because he's the root source of everything. So when the Most High first tries to get an understanding from these creatures that he made, what's going on, he took a particular route. He went from the man, and the man cast it onto the woman cast it onto the serpent. Now, when we open up Genesis chapter 3, verse 14, the Most High addresses the serpent first, then the woman, then the man, as opposed to his initial linear line of questioning from the man to the woman to the serpent. Judgment becomes rendered first to the serpent, then the woman, then the man. That's the context. And the reason why that's important is because the initial event that caused everything was the dialogue between the serpent and the woman. So now when the Most High is judging, he deals with the serpent first, since the serpent was the root of the issue, and juxtaposes the serpent and his consequences and aligns that with the woman and her consequences, and then it leads up to the man. The serpent is not documented as speaking to the man. So if the Most High is going to judge the serpent, he's going to judge the serpent based on his established relationship with the woman, not with the man. So anything he says to the serpent is not going to relate to the man, because the serpent did not speak to the man. He spoke to the woman. So now when the Most High is dishing out these judgments, he's very specific. He deals with the serpent first, and he curses the serpent that you're going to be on your belly all the days of your life, blah, blah. And what I would recommend for some fun additional reading, I want you guys to go back to Josephus's Antiquity of the Jews, and I want you to read his Antiquity of the Jews, where he is speaking about what happened in the garden, right? And he's the one that actually introduces, well, he doesn't introduce it for the first time, but for people reading about the culture for the first time, he introduces the fact that this serpent at one time had legs that he was walking on and had a ability to speak to the woman. And the reason why he had to be cursed to go on his belly is so that way he's never at the same level as the woman in order to speak to her. Right? This is what they convey. This is what's brought down via tradition. But when he's addressing the serpent and the woman, he curses the serpent to be on his belly. And in verse 15, he goes to the serpent and he tells the serpent, because remember, the serpent was responsible for beguiling the woman. So now the Most High is going to empower the woman to overcome the serpent. Again, this is only juxtaposing the relationship the serpent had with the woman, because the dialogue that took place explicitly was between the woman and the serpent, not the man. That's why when we continue to read it and we see where it says there that I will put enmity, and enmity will be, right? Eba, Hebrew, Abba. Enmity will be put between you and the woman, between your Zerachah, Ka, when you hear that at the end of a noun, means your. Zerah is what? Seed. Your seed. Not offspring. Your seed. And between her seed. Zera'ah. Right? Zera'ah. When you have the that's affixed to Zerah. Zerah is a masculine noun. It denotes the feminine seed. Her seed. So between your offspring and her offspring. Then it goes on to say, who? He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So what's important here? A lot of times people say, oh, you see, it says the woman's seed. So therefore, it's something that's coming out the woman that has nothing to do with the man. That is not what the text is telling us. The text is not saying that. Remember, the text is only speaking about the relationship between the serpent and the woman, and because the serpent beguiled the woman, in judgment, the woman will now have a power over the serpent, because the serpent thought he had the advantage in trying to bring down what the Most High had established, the order. So when it's talking about her seed, her zera'ah, her seed, and specifically referring to something that's coming out of her, that when the serpent sees that she's bearing seed, she's giving birth, something that's coming forth from her is going to be at enmity with the serpent seed and oppose the serpent seed. Now, do serpents have seed? Yeah, literal serpents do produce offspring. And some serpents can also do what's called parthenogenesis, which means that the female can produce a replica of herself without the intervention or insemination of the male. This is called parthenogenesis, right? So that means that she can birth an egg, and the egg will hatch and be another snake, but the egg will only have the chromosomes of the mom, which means it will be a complete replica of the mom. That means it would be feminine at all times. Okay, let me say that again. In parthenogenesis, whenever there is a lack of insemination from the male species and the female is producing seed on her own, it will always be female. It will not be male, because the offspring will only have the chromosomes from the mother, which will only be half, and it will not have the chromosomes from the father, because the father will determine the gender. As the father's not determining the gender and parthenogenesis happens with just the mother, it will only be a female entity. Now, for people who are messianic, and they go back to the text in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 2, and they read it, now they see something interesting. They see that if a virgin birth took place, and according to the laws of science, which the Most High can definitely intervene on, a male child being produced, then how can that be the case when it's understood that that whatever offspring that's created by the female, without the intervention of the male, will only have the chromosomes of the female, should, scientifically speaking, I'm not saying, speaking in all cases, should produce a female entity and not a male entity, unless we're talking about something different that's happening. And I'm going to show you guys something that's very interesting so you can better understand this context. So because the relationship between the serpent and the woman is what's being judged here, because the serpent beguiled the woman, the Most High is giving an advantage to the woman over the serpent because they both had an established relationship before the judgment took place. The man has nothing to do with this judgment in the sense where the seed that comes forth from the woman is a reminder to the serpent and his seed, wherever that may be, that something that comes out, whatever comes out of the woman, is always going to be at enmity or have animosity towards you, and you will have animosity towards it. And even though that you may bruise it, it is ultimately going to crush you, wherever that may be. Now, to validate this, if you go to Genesis chapter 4, Genesis chapter 4 is very interesting because it answers this. You'll see where, if you go to Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, and then we're going to go to Genesis chapter 4, verse 25. I'm going to show you something interesting. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, it says, now the man had relations with his wife Eve. So, if we're looking at Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, to refer to some kind of virgin birth, it is not what was understood by the author and the audience, and it definitely was not understood by Adam and Eve, because they're getting it in. They're having sex, right? So Adam is not like, okay, Eve, I'm not going to touch you. You know why? Because you have to have a virgin birth to destroy that serpent. That's not what happened, right? Huh? Hello?
No, that's not what happened. I had the phone on mute. I'm sorry. No.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah,
that's not what happened. But what did take place is that they came together, right? And sometimes in Hebrew we see the word yada, and yada is the word meaning to know something, know by experience. Now the man yada, the woman, right? And when he knew her, right, she conceived and bore a son, which was Cain. And she said, I have gotten a man from the Most High. Now, you're going to see why this is significant. I've gotten a man from the Most High. So the zerah that is in reference has to do with a man-child, because Eve is excited when she has this child. This is very important. She gets excited when she has this male offseed. Because remember, she has daughters too. And we're going to see that in Genesis chapter 5. But there's no mention of her daughters. Because she is being reminded every time she has a male seed, that out of this male seed, it will bring enmity between the serpent seed. Look at this. We go to Genesis chapter 4, verse 25. After Cain kills his brother, it says again in Genesis 4:25, and Adam knew his wife again, and she gave birth to a son. The word there is ben, to a son, and she called his name Seth. Now listen to this, family. For she said, Elohim has appointed. That's very important. That's the real word there. It's the word appointed, sit or seat. Has appointed to me a zerah. Wait, hold on. The Most High has given me seed. The word there is zerah. He has given me seed. Her seed. Her seed. Remember we read in Genesis 3:15? And out of her seed, she says right there, he has given me her seed. But guess what? In order for her to have that zerah, she had to know, or yet Adam. So it was not obviously in the mindset of the characters that some kind of virgin birth would have to take place. That is not what is being rendered there at all. They knew that in order for her to have a man-child, she had to know her husband. You know why? Because they was under the divine law of procreation. The Most High says, what? Be fruitful and multiply. That is a divine decree. Be fruitful and multiply. So in the culture, In order for you to be fruitful and multiply, the man has to know the woman in order to produce seed. And when we're reading in Genesis chapter 3 and chapter 4, where chapter 3 says Zera'ah, her seed, and then we go to Genesis 4 and 25, she identifies her seed as being Seth. She says, he has given me another seed instead of Abel, which was Seth. So she understood, and mind you, she was working only on the operational knowledge of empirical data that she had access to at that time, and that was what the Most High said in prospect, or the prophecy that he gave in regards to her relationship with the serpent. So she is thirsty for this man-child to come forth to fulfill this prophecy in regards to being the enmity or the buffer against the serpent and his seed. And it's because of their interaction, things got corrupted. So she wanted some form of comfort from that, right? And it had to come from a male child. This is why she got excited for a male child, and this is why it's only recorded her male sons, and the rest of the male sons outside of Seth, Cain, and Abel are not mentioned, and the female daughters are also not mentioned, which is very peculiar, right? Because when we go to Genesis chapter 5, we see something very interesting. Genesis chapter 5, verse 4 says, Then the days of Adam, after he became the father of Seth, were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Well, who are these other people? Who are these other sons and daughters? The text never tells us. It never explains to us who these other people are, right? Because it is in the mind of the author to the audience that the only thing that is important for us to follow is the lineage of Seth. That's what's important. The lineage of Seth. The lineage of Cain is also mentioned, right? Because that was the oppositional force that brought about the flood. And his seed and whoever else was on the earth, whether if we believe that it was just Cain and his sister that he went and took from Nod, maybe she was born before him and she had left and went somewhere else, and then he met her later in another area of the earth and he married her, took her to be his wife and had children, or if this was a female from a previous creation and he married her. Either way, after the flood, it is irrelevant because that seed did not continue. That seed was destroyed. That seed was intended to be wiped out, right? So I bring this here to say that when we read the text within its context, you have a pretext, context, and subtext. A lot of times, what people will do is that they'll have a pretext understanding, which means that they'll bring their own presuppositions into the text to make the text align with what they believe. Then you have people who approach it via the subtext, and what means that they'll cherry pick from the text to align with what they believe, or they'll misinterpret the text to align with what they believe. Then you have people who read it in context, which means that con means with. They allow the text to guide them and allow the text to speak for itself and allow the text to exemplify its motive for being recorded and its intention to us today. And when you read it within that context, you don't have to create new doctrines, right? You let the text speak for itself, and when it speaks for itself, you concern yourself with the things that the text concerns itself with, because anything that it does not mention to you, it does that for a reason. But us having the Hellenistic Western mindset, we want to know, well, what is that? Why is that there? Well, who are these on the? And then we argue ad infinitum, where we will perpetually try to figure something out that the text purposely did not want to tell us. And it puts us in that loop, and we stay in that loop for a long time. And sometimes it's good to get in that loop if it helps you to re-engage the text anew, so it becomes fresh for you. But it's not okay when you're in a perpetual mindset to try and to figure it out if the text decides that it does not want to tell you specifically. That means that you are speculating at best. And speculation is not bad. It's only bad when you turn speculation into a fact. Then it becomes an issue. So we have to read the text the way the author intended for the audience, and when we allow it to speak for itself, there are things there that it tells us that we typically didn't see it before because we had blinders on before. But when we remove those blinders and use the tools that we need to study, we start to see things in the text that we didn't see before, and it helps to give us all the keys that we need to unlock and answer things that we previously didn't know before.
Well, I definitely have some, some notes and some nuggets that I'm going to go back over. I see a lot. So, I mean, that do make sense what you said about basically they gave us what they wanted us to see, because I thought, like in chapter 3, when I seen the trees, and the fruit, I looked at it like, how we were sometimes compared as trees and the fruit that we bear, we bring forth fruit, good fruit or bad fruit. And I was looking at it like she ate the wrong fruit, it wasn't good fruit. And she brought that back to her husband. Now, that fruit can represent knowledge, worldly wisdom or doctrines or whatever. That's what I was, thinking. As since I've been in the truth. But before that, I was thinking maybe this was kind of literal a little bit, because I did see a documentary where they said snakes had arms and legs or something before. Like they found a skeleton or something like that. So with everything you put in perspective, I'm definitely going to go over this again and read this again, though. Really deep, some nuggets, though. Does anybody have any questions or anything? No questions.
Yeah, I got a couple of questions. First, I want to say I've been on the conversation for a while, and I appreciate everything that you've been saying, brother. I got a couple of books that you told me to read. You said Josephus, Antiquity of the Jews, the Interlinear Bible, or the Lexicon and the Concordance. Is there any other books that I can read up on to help me gain knowledge of the 12 tribes or a better understanding of the Bible?
Okay, sure. When you say 12 tribes, can you expound on that? What do you mean when you say 12 tribes?
I'm just the history on it outside of the Bible, anything that I can get to help me align with the facts that I get from the Bible.
And you're talking about specifically for these both Jacob and their offspring, descendants?
Right.
Okay. It depends on how you want to approach that. Now, there's like, I'll give you an example. Being that we're reading about Genesis chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, and we even touched on 5 today. We brought that up. If you go into like the book that I gave you reference to, Josephus, Antiquity of the Jews. If you go to book 1, book 1 talks from the creation to the death of Isaac, right? And if you guys want to get that for free without having to pay for it, you can go to a site that's called sacred-text.com and /JUD.
Repeat that one more time, brother.
Yes, sacred-text, TEXTS.com, sacred-text.com /JUD, which is short for Judaism, /Josephus. And when you click on that, it'll give you the works of Josephus. And then from there, they have like the War of the Jews, Antiquity of the Jews. If you click on the Antiquity of the Jews, book 1, and you read chapter 2, it goes more in detail into what we were reading in Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, right? It gives you more information. And what that means is that Josephus' writings are scripture, right? So it's not the definitive account for anything. The text itself is. But what his works does do is that it gives you an insight into the first century Yahudim mindset, right, of the Israelites at that time. It puts you into their worldview on how they interpreted what they were reading in the text. And I'll give you an example for that, right? It says in chapter 2, portion 2, it says, and when Cain had traveled over many countries, he, with his wife, built a city named Nod, which is a place so called, and there he settled his abode, where also he had children. However, he did not accept of his punishment in order to amendment, but to increase his wickedness, for he only aimed to procure everything that was for his own bodily pleasure, though it obliged him to be injurious to his neighbors. He augmented his household substance with much wealth by rapine and violence. He excited his acquaintance to procure pleasures and spoils by robbery, and became a great leader of men into wicked courses. He also introduced a change in the way of simplicity wherein men lived before, and was the author of measures and weights. And whereas they lived innocently and generously, while they knew nothing of such art, he changed the world into cunning craftiness. Now, this gives you more information that we didn't see before in the text, because this is a tradition that was an addendum that followed alongside or was complementary to the reading that people would have of the actual written text. So to give you more insight on Cain, if you go right before that in chapter 2, section 1, it says that, but in return God convicted Cain as having been the murderer of his brother, and said, I wonder at thee that thou knowest not what is become of a man whom thou thyself hast destroyed. God therefore did not inflict the punishment of death upon him on account of his offering sacrifice, and thereby making supplication to him not to be extreme in his wrath to him, but he made him accursed. So what it's saying is the reason why the Most High did not kill Cain is because Cain still gave him an offering. And that offering was on behalf of his sin. This is why he was not killed. So this is the archetype, according to Josephus, of the sacrifices that we see in Torah that comes later on, right, when you give a sin sacrifice. So we see that. Actually, to be honest with y'all, when you go back to Genesis, here's another nugget. Oh, I'm just blowing you out with nuggets. If you go to Genesis chapter 4, where the Most High is speaking to Cain, right? He says to him in chapter 4, verse 6, it says, then when Yah said to Cain, why are you angry? Why your countenance falling? If you do well, your countenance will be lifted up. And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at your door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. That's interesting, right? Sin is at your door, and it is looking to desire you. Now, when we go into the Hebrew, the word there for sin is hatat. Hatat is there for sin. And interestingly enough, hatat does not only just mean sin, but it can also reference a sin offering for atonement. It could be the punishment for sin, and sometimes a punishment would mean you'd have to give a sacrifice on behalf of sin, or it could be the act itself. It could be a numerous amount of things. So let's say that Cain was being told that if you don't do well, then a guilt offering is going to be out your door, and its desire is for you. And when you look up that word desire, which is another interesting key, you'll see that it has a similar implication, similar word, same word that we see in Genesis 3:16. Genesis 3:16 says, the woman says to the woman, yet your desire will be for your husband. We see that same word, teshukah. Teshukah. We see that same word there, desire. Look that word up. That's a very interesting word because it's only in 3 verses in the whole entire Tanakh. It's only in 3 verses. Look that word up. It's very interesting. But the key here is the guilt offering or the punishment for sin. And if Josephus is saying the reason why the Most High did not kill him, right, or punish him based on his sin was because of a sacrifice that he made. Remember, he gave the Most High a sacrifice, right? Now, did he sacrifice after he committed the act? Who knows? I don't know. That's up for speculation. The text is not explicit. But when we read what the tradition, at least the tradition from what Josephus believed, remember, Josephus was considered to be a Pharisee, right? They proposed him to be from one of the Pharisees. Remember, Josephus was not a book scholar. Josephus was one of the individuals responsible for revolting against the Romans to the point where he pulled a sword and was killing Romans. So we're not talking about a man that was only behind a desk in a book. This dude was in there getting it in. He's putting in that work. And he's cutting heads off and everything. And the only reason why he was still alive is because he didn't get a chance to kill himself. He surrendered, right? So he didn't get a chance to kill himself. Otherwise, we would not have none of this information if he did kill himself. But it's almost like those kamikaze soldiers, right? Instead of them being taken in, they would kill themselves. The Sicarii would do the same thing as well. And a lot of them were influenced by the Pharisees, right, who were upset with the way the Romans were treating them. And the Sadducees, on the other hand, were okay with their oppressors, right, the people that was oppressing them. But that's another subject matter altogether. But when you read this, he gives you more information on the tradition, on how they view this story of Adam and Eve and going into Cain, and then we get more information into that, right? So you asked me what other material can we get to understand the text. I said if you want to understand the language, you can get an interlinear. You can get access to a free interlinear by going to BibleHub.com, right? You go to BibleHub.com, and when you go to BibleHub.com, you have at the very top a search box that you can type in any verse that you want. And once you type in the verse, let's say, I don't know, let's go to Genesis 4:1. Let's say we want to do Genesis 4:1. If you click on Genesis 4:1, and you have that verse there that we read earlier, it says Adam knew his wife. Right above Genesis 4:1 is an option that says interlinear. If you click on interlinear, what it will do for you is it'll reveal to you the interlinear portion of the text, okay? And it'll give you the Strong's Concordance at the top. It'll give you the transliterated word from English to Hebrew underneath. It'll actually give you the Hebrew word there, and it's not the root word, right? It doesn't give you roots when you read the actual Hebrew itself. The Strong's Concordance gives you the root word sans the grammar. It just gives you the root word. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. The word understand, right, is a syntax between under and stand, but when you syntax under and stand, it becomes a word. If you was reading a sentence and you seen the word understanding and a number was placed above the word understanding, let's say 120, and you click on 120 and it brings you back to the root word understand, it is only telling you what the root word means, but it's not giving you all the information how that word relates to the sentence, because we have the ing, which is the present participle that is suffixed to the word understand, that gives us more information to how that word is in relation to the rest of the clause or the rest of the sentence, right? So the concordance or a lexicon only primarily gives you the root word. It doesn't show you how the word is modified, right? Or it doesn't parse the word for you or separate it. It just gives you the root word. And that's okay if you want to familiarize yourself with definitions of words and understand what words mean, right? So it gives you the concordance, which is a beginner's reference, right? There are other lexicons that are much deeper, but starting off, it's just a good point of reference. It gives you the concordance entry. It gives you the transliterated word of the Hebrew. It gives you the Hebrew, not the word itself, but it gives you the Hebrew within its grammatical position in the sentence. And then it gives you the literal English translation of that Hebrew clause right above it. And when you read what you start to see is you'll start to be able to read the text the way a Hebrew reader would read the text. It'll show you literally in English how it's read in the mind of a person who knows Hebrew and how they read the text. So it gives you a literal translation of what that Hebrew is right above it. And this is a great way to find trends, to understand how certain suffixes work, how certain prefixes work. You'll start to see these things, right? And it's a very invaluable tool with helping you follow the language of the text, right? How to follow the grammar of the text, how to follow the words of the text. And it helps you more in-depthly with your studies, okay? And people who know Hebrew should make these tools accessible to other people so they can fact-check what they teach them. A lot of times they don't, because they want to be the ones in charge of the information and for you to trust what they tell you. I'm not that type of person, right? I give you the same tools that I use to come to my conclusion so that way you can decide for yourself, right? So when we look at, like I said, these additional books, which would be Josephus' works, Antiquities of the Jews, depending upon what part of the text you're interested in is where I would direct you to where to go. But what I will say is first start with an interlinear and familiarize yourself with just knowing words in Hebrew, right? Just know the words and look to see where else the words are used in the text because it helps to bring light to the word and how it's used in other portions of the text. So sometimes you'll see an obscure sentence in the text, and there's several of them in the Bible, an obscure sentence, and it's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And then the thing that you do is when you see an obscure sentence, the most important thing is to look at the words that make up the sentence and find out what is the most challenging word here. Like, what word is here that's making the sentence obscure? And once you discover that word, you go back to see the definition of that word, and you go to see where else the word is used. And when you follow where else this word is used, the other entries where the word is will give you more information that you can take and go back to that verse and start to plug it in and say, okay, look, I read here, it was saying this, and that. And you pull from those passages what the word entails within those passages and try to play a word, not a word game, but play a game where you try to insert it, into that obscure passage until one plugs in and makes sense. And you're like, oh, okay, well, hey, if I read it with this understanding that this passage over here expounded upon, now it doesn't become obscure no more. Now it starts to make sense. And words can help you unlock a much deeper understanding of the text because it helps to resolve a lot of conundrums that we experience when we read the text and we get confounded. So words is excellent. It helps you. So interlinear is great. And, again, that will help you learn the language as well because you start to, like I said, learn about suffixes and prefixes and infixes that are all used to modify a verb or a noun. And it does so because it places the root word in a grammatical status within a sentence. So that way you can start get a better understanding. So I would say get it interlinear. For Genesis, again, you can read the Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees is another addendum. And the reason why Jubilees is important is I'll say this. The oldest manuscripts that we have of Torah in Hebrew is the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls is the oldest we have. They go back to 3rd century BCE. That's the oldest. 3rd century, anywhere from 300 to 200 BCE. Some of the manuscripts that are extra biblical go back further than that, to the 4th century BCE, which is 400 to 300 BCE. So the reason why I say this is because amongst the Tanakh and the books that make up the Tanakh, and the Tanakh is an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketubim, right? So Torah means instruction. Literally, it comes from the root word yara, and yara is an archery term which means to aim an arrow towards the mark. Torah is a play on that word, which is the instruction on how to aim the arrow towards that mark. Nevi'im or Nebi or Nebai literally means a prophet or spokesman. So Nebi'im, im is the masculine plural, prophets. So instructions, prophets, and ketub. Katab means to write. Ketub is a book. Ketubim is plural for books. So we're looking at the books or the writings, the Nevi'im or the prophets, and the Torah or the instruction. Torah ot, which would be the feminine plural, which would mean instructions plural, but it's really just instruction. So we have that makes up Tanakh, and that is the corpus of the Tanakh, and it's divided in those categories when you read it the way that it was codified and compiled by the Yahudim. And the Yahudim just is another word for Jews that we use colloquially today, right? So I would say get you an interlinear, read the Book of Jubilees, because that book was found in numerous portions amongst Dead Sea Scrolls, because whoever the people were, the scribes were, that lived in the Qumran caves, they saw it fit that the Book of Jubilees was very important to them, and they had several copies, right, because they saw it as being equally as important as the rest of the Tanakh. Now, we can make the distinction whether or not it is, but to them it was. So, Again, when you read it, it also gives you a summary of creation, right? And what it does is that it also, if it's not scripture to you, what it can do is at least show you the tradition on how people interpreted the text, which can open up or broaden your scope of understanding the text itself, right? And then you also have the Talmud, right? And the Talmud has commentary on certain passages in the text. You have the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, and they're two different Talmuds. They're not the same. And the Talmud is a corpus or a body of various texts. It has the Mishnah in it. It has the Gemara in it. And a lot of these had to do with the various Sanhedrin council rulings. And then it also has commentary in it as well. So you can read the commentary of the Talmud to also get another stream of tradition to see how those people interpreted the text, right? And this is just a way to have all the evidence in front of you before you come to a bottom line conclusion. So these are things that you can look. You can get you a Babylonian Talmud and read the commentary from that. You can also get some Targums. And Targum is a paraphrase, an Aramaic paraphrases of the Tanakh, right? More specifically, the Torah. And this also helps you to better, in layman's terms, understand the priestly writing of the Torah Tanakh. So all of these things I'm mentioning is just various schools of thought that had their own interpretive analysis of the text, and it helps you to get a bigger picture of how those traditions interpreted the text. But if you want to do it from yourself, you have to be familiar with the text by flushing your presuppositions out. That means the doctrines that you bring into reading the text, and allow the text to breathe to you instead of you breathing into the text, right? And if you do that, then it will open up a world of discovery for you.